Good morning, Carroll County. This is Brian DiLeonardo, your state's attorney, with this week's State's Attorney's Report. Um, Annapolis has been interesting this year. I had the opportunity to go down a number of times on behalf of the Maryland State's Attorneys Association to advocate or to argue against different pieces of legislation. And one of the things that we're really fortunate of in Carroll County is to have some great legislators that represent us down there that get it. They get where we come from as prosecutors and law enforcement. And this morning, I'm happy to have one of them with me. We're this morning are joined by Delegate Haven Shoemaker. So good morning, Haven.
Good morning. Well, it's great to be here.
Well, and we are really happy to have you because I know certainly myself and a lot of the listeners out there are interested. Let's talk a little bit about legislation. First of all, before we get into any specific legislation, give me a general idea of how the session was.
All right. Well, the session was, as we predicted going in, one of the more difficult ones that I've had. And I mean, I've only been down there. This is my fifth session. But we anticipated, in view of the election results from November, wherein we lost 8 seats in the Maryland House of Delegates, that there would be an appreciable shift to the left. And we certainly saw that. There was a strong tilt towards what I'll characterize as rabid environmentalism. There was a concerted effort to curtail folks' Second Amendment rights, and there was a climate down there where the legislature did not want to give back any money to the folks here at home because they wanted to bankroll everything to fund the Kerwin recommendations. So, other than that, it was great.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm sure it's a lot to be fighting against down there. Well, let's talk specifically about some legislations that affect criminal laws, regulatory laws, and specifically I want to start with an area I have a great interest in is the gun legislation that we saw sort of coming out in Annapolis this year. Fortunately, I think there was a lot of good defeats of bills that we were able to stop in order to protect Second Amendment rights.
Thank goodness for the Senate.
Absolutely. But I'd like to hear your perspective on some of the bills and why you found them troubling.
Well, first of all, I gave a floor speech down there on the 3D gun ban bill. And the interesting thing about that particular piece of legislation was that a documented crime has never been committed in the history of the state of Maryland using one of these 3D guns. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, my arguments on the floor notwithstanding, it passed the House, but they were able to kill it in the Senate.
And I can tell you from the prosecutor standpoint, it is incredibly frustrating. We were very much in support of the governor's bill asking to increase the mandatory time for a second, not just the first, but the second conviction for a crime of violence while using a handgun. These are people that are robbing people and shooting people. And they refuse to pass that bill. But yet at the same time, we're going to try to outlaw 3D guns that is, as you point out, is not linked for one crime that's going on in the state.
Right. So, that's part of the ongoing criminal coddling effort that I've seen out of the Maryland General Assembly over the last 5 sessions, and it's been ratcheted up a notch
very frustrating.
After the election that I just referred to a little while ago.
Yeah, very frustrating. I mean, again, another good example, I think, is the attempt to now subject rifles and shotguns to those transfer restrictions and backgrounds that we do with regulated firearms. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, part of the problem with that is very few homicides have been committed since 2016. I think those are the numbers that they use. Mm-hmm. Since 2016, using a long arm. Again, that's another piece of legislation that passed the House, and thankfully, the Judicial Proceedings Committee over on the Senate side was able to kill that. So, and my hats off to Senator Reedy, who serves on that committee over there, for his role in making sure that legislation didn't see the light of day.
Well, and I think that's one of the frustrating as a prosecutor. I spent many years actually handling and running a firearms trafficking unit where we tracked down a lot of these guns that were used in homicides in Baltimore City, and trying to stem where are the illegal guns. And what is frustrating is that all of these attempts to regulate law-abiding gun owners does absolutely nothing to stem the crime tide that we see. And I think that's what's really frustrating. When it's 3D guns or this kind of bill, and none of it does anything. And the things that do something, which is taking people off the street, out of commission, putting them in jail, we know they're not going to shoot again.
Right.
None of that gets even through committee.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that virtually every homicide that's committed in Baltimore City, of the 300 plus that happen per annum down there, those crimes are perpetrated by folks that aren't even shouldn't legally be allowed to possess a firearm in the first place. So restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens further, even more than they did in 2013 with that abominable piece of legislation that they passed back then, is not going to do a thing to curtail violence in Baltimore City.
Absolutely true. I mean, I dealt with that for years. I know where the guns were coming. I mean, trust me that the people that are shooting down on Broadway, they do not get those weapons by going into the gun shop and applying and doing that. So,
and what has happened in Baltimore City since they passed that legislation in 2013?
Right.
Well, in fact, homicides have proliferated since then. So
yeah, it's just frustrating. I mean, politics aside, from as a prosecutor standpoint, it's very frustrating because our goal is to want to make people safer, and what that is, we're going to support. And this kind of legislation, it just doesn't do it, and it's very frustrating. I mean, another aspect that came up that I wanted to touch on is the Handgun Review Board. That was really a surprise to see this year, that the way that was sort of vacated. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
All right. So the Handgun Permit Review Board is a board that's been in place for many, many years. The appointees to the Handgun Permit Review Board come from the governor. So the idea behind doing away with the Handgun Permit Review Board clearly is directed against the current governor. Sure. There's no doubt about it. So what that legislation would do is it would obviate the need for a handgun permit review board, and it would vest the authority for making these decisions about the issuance of gun permits with the Office of Administrative Hearings.
Right.
So, I mean, and there was already an appeal mechanism in place to the OAH.
And I when I was a private attorney, I represented people in front of the Handgun Review Board, and it gave a great opportunity because sometimes it's a nice place to make your case with citizens that are a part of that, as opposed to simply regulatory administrative people that are reviewing it with the state police. Again, I have the highest respect for them, but we all have different decision makings, and depending who was superintendent, it could affect whether it was granted or not.
Right.
So it was another mechanism that we had.
And this is another example of the legislature looking for, a solution towards a problem. It really doesn't exist because there's not been any opinions from any appellate court that second guess the issuance of permits by the Handgun Permit Review Board.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're running a little long here, but I want to get one last thing in, Delegate, while you're here. That certainly you and I discussed this during the legislative session, which was the change in the law when it came to our license and the ability to not basically assign a gender. Can you tell us about that and what your concerns were in arguing against it?
Well, you're talking about the X marks the spot bill.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So this would allow people to put X as their gender marker on their driver's license, as opposed to picking, either male or female. And last I checked, I told folks on the floor that I called my doctor, Dr. Welby, and as far as he could tell, there was still only two genders. Right. So that argument fell on deaf ears too. Right. But I understand from a prosecutorial standpoint that there are some issues presented.
Yeah,
by
we
that.
did, and it was issues that we had raised. I mean, we had concerns because we have, for example, the people that flee and warrants, and a lot of the systems set up, you have to put in a gender. That's the way it's set up. And again, when we're putting out lookouts and we're trying to do identifying information, sometimes we may only have the name and a gender and a description. And if you don't know which gender that could be, and you have a gender neutral names, that could create an issue. You wouldn't know whether you were looking for a male or a female. So there's really no consultation with law enforcement or how this could affect the job that we have to do. I guess it's just another one of those feel-good pieces of legislation.
Well, that and styrofoam bans and things of that nature.
Right.
Yeah, it's indicative of the progressive shift that occurred after November. I can tell you that.
Well, Delegate, I want to thank you again so much for coming in this morning and sharing with all of us some of your experiences from Annapolis, and I hope we can get you back soon.
Oh, I'd love to.
All right, excellent. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Again, this is Brian DiLeonardo, your state's attorney, and we'll see you soon.